All right, welcome to Chapter 11. We're going to talk about adaptations to aerobic and anaerobic training. This should, I hope, be a bit of a familiar topic for you guys. We've touched on all of these items over the previous lectures, so that's why I feel really comfortable leaving this one as a recording. But hopefully we're going to stress some new stuff as well, so it'll keep it interesting. But to start off with, we're going to talk about aerobic exercise. Aerobics, any long duration endurance activity where you can sustain a pace for several minutes at a time. If you continue to do that workout after workout over weeks and months and years, you'll see a lot of chronic adaptations in your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, your muscles, and within your muscles, metabolic adaptations that make you a better oxygen consuming machine. And we're going to explore each of these in turn, starting off with the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular parameters that are affected by endurance training are manifold because this is the type of training that most stresses the cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen quickly. But the exciting stuff you see is your heart gets bigger, your stroke volume gets bigger, your heart rate changes under different conditions as a consequence of a larger stroke volume, and your cardiac output at maximum exercise is able to be much higher because your stroke volume is much larger and your heart rate is essentially the same. Your blood flow and your blood pressure and your blood volume also change as well, and we'll explore each of these in turn as we continue our journey into Chapter 11. But starting off with the big one with the cardiovascular system, your heart. You get a bigger heart. Doesn't mean you're a kinder person. It just means the muscular pump that is your heart gets larger, as any muscle does when you stress it. It hypertrophies and gets bigger. And the cool thing that you can see is your heart is particularly the left ventricle. And again, that's the most important chamber because it does eject blood to your whole system. If you look at an endurance-trained athlete here on the left, you will see the thicker ring here. That represents a thicker muscular wall. And then the opening here, also known as the lumen, that is the space within the ventricle. That gets larger as well in comparison to somebody who does not exercise. So you get a bigger heart. It can hold more blood, and the wall that pumps that blood is thicker. It's a thicker muscle, a stronger muscle. This is a very key, adaptation to endurance exercise specifically. The type of stress you place on the heart with endurance exercise, where you're cramming the heart more full of blood, using the Frank-Starling mechanism to increase stroke volume. That makes the heart get thicker walls and a larger chamber size, or lumen, or internal ventricular diameter. That gets bigger, whereas resistance training, where you're doing weights, you get thicker walls a little bit. You can see the thicker ring here compared to the sedentary person, but you don't see a bigger space within the ventricle, and that's the typical adaptation you see. So any exercise you do, either endurance training or resistance training, will make your heart's walls thicker. Endurance training probably more so, but endurance training has the big benefit of allowing you to hold more blood within your heart. And that's kind of a key difference, which we'll touch on even more. This is kind of a cool slide because it compares different dimensions of the heart between bodybuilders and endurance-trained athletes. And actually, kind of funny, they misspelled athletes. I got that slide from textbook. I didn't spell that. That's them. But key thing about this is that, bodybuilders, endurance-trained athletes, you're probably talking about at least a 50-pound difference in total body mass. So, bodybuilders generally much larger, more muscular individuals than endurance-trained athletes. You wouldn't want to have to force Mr. Olympia to run a marathon. That would kill him. You wouldn't be able to do it. But bodybuilders, much larger muscles, except for their cardiac muscle, their heart. This is on the left here, just an absolute comparison of size. And you see here the bodybuilder on the left, the endurance-trained athlete on the right. If you were just autopsy these guys, put their hearts on a table and look at different dimensions of size. This is the septum, the dividing line between your left and right ventricles. This is the end diastolic diameter, so that's the space within the heart that holds blood. And this is the posterior wall, that's the thickness of the back wall of the heart. They look pretty much the freaking same. Not much difference, but that's just the heart itself. Much different in, a 230-pound individual, say here, and a 130-pound individual, say here. The endurance athlete is a much smaller absolute individual overall, and their heart's the same size. And that's why the graph on the right here is much more interesting, because this is looking at the size of the heart relative to the size of the whole person. And here you see the dramatic difference where the endurance athlete, the space within their ventricles relative to the rest of them is much, much larger. Their walls, or the septum and the posterior wall, are both thicker relative to their size. So relative to their total body size, total body mass, endurance athletes have much larger hearts. And that is a consistent finding across multiple studies, but this one is a very good illustration. And if you look at the overall dimensions of cardiac muscle that are increased with training, myocardial wall thickness, so just the thickness of the walls of the heart. Again, with endurance training, you get larger chambers within the heart. They can hold more blood, and really all the walls. The septum, the dividing line between the left and the right side, that gets thicker. The back wall, posterior wall gets thicker, and then the left ventricular mass overall get thicker. And it's a massive stimulus to make your heart bigger over time if you do endurance training. And here is yet another comparison study. Cyclists, runners, strength athletes. The cool thing about this data is this is comparing these athletes to not one another, but to age and size matched controls. So unlike the previous slide where it was looking at the bodybuilder versus the endurance athlete, and there might be a 100-pound difference in their mass, these are comparisons to people who are the same age and the same size. And this is probably a better picture of how the effective training itself makes the impact on the size of your heart. And you see cyclists and runners, this is the size of the chamber of the heart, internal diameter of the left ventricle, mean wall thickness, and left ventricular mass. So this is essentially the thickness of the musculature on these two slides, or two columns, I should say. Quite substantially different between the endurance athletes and their age and size match controls. And even the strength athlete has much larger left ventricular mass than their age and size match control, and mean wall thickness is much greater. But the big story in terms of differences between the two is I alluded to earlier, endurance training, you get basically a 10% greater space in your ventricles to hold more blood. Strength training, maybe like 3-4%. It's not that dramatic a difference, and maybe not statistically significant difference, whereas this is a meaningful clinical difference. And that's the difference in the stress that's placed on the heart by the different forms of exercise. You see different adaptations to the heart as a consequence. The endurance athlete gets a larger heart, thicker walls, and increased holding capacity within the heart to hold more blood. Internal diameter, or the lumen, the opening within the heart, is bigger. The strength athlete gets thicker walls, but not so much the increase in chamber size. Now, an enlarged heart, when it's used in most contexts, people think, oh, that's bad. And in most contexts, they're correct. As once was thought that any increase in heart size was a disease state or a pathological state. And the reason for that is simply because most times when doctors see a patient who has an enlarged heart, it is a disease state. If you have chronic high blood pressure, hypertension, that's a stress on your heart, just as exercise is a stress on your heart. It's a never-ending stress on your heart. And as an adaptation, patients who have hypertension, their hearts get thicker, similar in dimensions to somebody who does strength training. That is still taught in some medical schools. One of my former students, who's a doctor now, he had that lecture where they were saying how the enlarged heart is always bad. And he, being the kind of smart ass he is, he actually looked up the references and disputed his teachers and distributed it to all his fellow students. And they still passed him. It's amazing. But he was right. It's actually with exercise, you do get a bigger heart. That's not bad. Cardiac muscle mass increased. Larger heart from exercise is a good thing. It makes your heart a bigger, stronger, more muscular pump. The difference is, one, with endurance training, your heart's better at holding more blood and pumping harder, so that's a good thing. Even with strength training, your heart's better at pumping more blood because of the thicker wall. It can't hold as much blood as an endurance-trained athlete's heart, but it's not facing chronic stress, and that's the key thing. You resistance train for, probably really, if you sum it all up, like several minutes over like an hour workout. You know, you're doing a 30-second work interval, and then you rest 3 minutes before you do it again. You repeat that for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. But it's not a huge amount of time where you're actually stressing the heart. And consequently, it's a positive adaptation. It's a positive adaptation. Your heart's a better pump. Why you see difference in development of the heart between an endurance athlete and a strength athlete is due to the different kind of stress you place on the heart. With endurance training, you place what's called a preload on the heart. When you look at the stress on the heart from endurance training, when you're doing running, cycling, swimming, any of those aerobic activities that you can sustain for many minutes at a time, if you're into that sort of thing, you're pushing more blood back to the heart faster. So by doing that, you're stretching out the ventricles before, that's what the pre refers to, it's before the heart contracts, you're loading it by stuffing it full of blood. So you see an increase in cardiac output, and you don't see an increase in diastolic blood pressure. And that's what aerobic exercise does. Your heart gets bigger, the muscular walls get thicker, and it can also hold more blood. That's what a preload does. In contrast, when you do weight training, diastolic blood pressure goes up, and as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in maximum deadlifts and trained powerlifters, diastolic blood pressure can get as high as over 300, which is crazy high. And at that high pressure, you're choking blood supply back to the heart. Your heart has to pump out blood into a super duper high pressure of systemic circulation. So that's the stress it faces, is after it's contracted, it's pushing out blood into a high pressure zone. That's what afterload means. It's after contraction. That's when it's facing the stress. And that's why you see the different adaptation. The heart gets thicker in the presence, or the face of an afterload, I should say, but it doesn't expand to hold more blood because it's not getting more blood back to it. It's not getting stretched. So that's why you have the two stresses. Afterload is from resistance training. Systolic and diastolic blood pressure go up. Preload is from endurance training, where only systolic blood pressure goes up. Diastolic blood pressure does not increase with aerobic exercise. And that's why you see the changes in the heart as you do between the two types of exercise. As you eject blood from the heart, that's your stroke volume with one single beat of the heart, how much blood you're spitting out. And with aerobic exercise, because your heart gets bigger, because it can hold more blood and it's ejecting just as hard, it will eject more blood. And that's really the main functional adaptation you see from endurance exercise. You see greater stroke volume. Blood volume increases with training. We'll talk about that more, but you make more blood, so you have more blood total circulation, more coming back to your ventricles, greater preload. Heart contracts harder, greater stroke volume. Your heart gets bigger over time, greater stroke volume as well. And that's what you see here. Same person, pre-training, post-training. As they get fitter with every workload, their stroke volume is substantially higher. And where they used to top out here, because they're able to achieve a higher stroke volume, their workload goes much higher. They see a substantial increase in their maximum workload, their maximum VO2 max, thanks in very large part to the greater stroke volume. So that's the exciting heart change you see with endurance exercise. If you can achieve a better stroke volume, that's going to give you better heart performance at max exercise. And you do. That's the natural adaptation to endurance activity. This is just some more illustrations. Pre-training, post-training differences in different dimensions of the heart. End diastolic volume is ventricular filling. End systolic is after the ventricle is contracted. And ejection fraction is the percentage of blood you pump out with each beat. And as you see, the purple lines are post-training. You can fill the heart with more blood under any condition. End systolic volume at rest and light exercise is not really dramatically different because you still have some blood remaining. It's actually a little bit higher at rest, but ejection fraction, again, at lighter workloads, it doesn't make much difference. 60% is more than adequate. You're well above that in either condition. But when you get to max exercise, the much higher stroke volume, much higher ejection fraction here, that's the sign that your heart is not only a bigger pump, a better pump, but it's a more efficient pump. You're more completely emptying it with each beat. And that's a great sign of a high-functioning heart. Again, ejection fractions below 40 are considered heart failure. Having a higher ejection fraction, the harder you work, is better. That's a heart that's more efficient, functioning as a better pump. But I'm out of time for this round, so this endeth part 1. Hope it's been fun.